Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I know it's hard to get here with the traffic, but we will begin our New Ukraine Investment Conference. First, before we begin, I'd like to say one very important word. At last year's conference, I was very honored. We had the conference opened by Bogdan Gavrilishin, who was probably the most revered representative of Ukraine globally, great thinker. Over the last year, we unfortunately have lost him. And I would like to ask the Gavrilishin Foundation to come up and join us, and also representative of the family as well, to say a few words. Before they do, I want to say that in the crisis that we happened, the banking crisis, a lot of people were affected. And if you could join me. Come. A lot of people were affected, companies, by the banks going down, and one of them actually, $2 million was lost due to Bank Reshete going down from the Gavrilishin Foundation. So we would like to have everyone, when possible, support this foundation. This is the corporate social responsibility, and it's very important. Please say a few words.
Thank you. So it is a great pleasure and honor and privilege for me to be here as a representative of Bogdan Gavrilishin Charitable Foundation. I was lucky to work with Dr. Bogdan Gavrilishin for more than 10 years. He was really a person of the global scale. He was a true member of the world society of the top level, but he always remained a Ukrainian, in spite of the fact that he had a Canadian passport and lived most of his time in Switzerland. He remained Ukrainian, and he believed in Ukraine, not only because he was a great patriot of Ukraine, but also because he was an economist, and he knew that the potential of Ukraine is great. The country has rich mineral resources, natural resources, and it is also a country with a huge human capital. And that's why Dr. Bogdan Gavrilishin invested in Ukraine. He founded his foundation in Kiev more than 8 years ago. And he invested in human capital, in young, professional, correct Ukrainians who would like to stay in this country and change it into a better one. That's why he established a program, Young Generation Will Change Ukraine. It has already more than 500 participants, and hopefully, if the foundation will have a chance to continue its work, to continue the work of Dr. Gavrilishin, the program will continue, and his work will live and help make our country a better one. So I wish you a successful conference, fruitful discussions, and a great future for Ukraine, because it deserves it. Thank you.
I'm John Shmorhan, representing the family of Bogdan Petrovich. My wife is his daughter, had 3 children, Grisha, Ina, Kristina, Leszek. Here to pass on their best regards. Unfortunately, my wife could not make it today. That the foundation will continue. Children, that Bogdan Petrovich devoted his life to Ukraine. And a small reminder to all of you. You know, his proposed, the United Nations proposed Declaration of Human Obligations is at the stand of Bogdan Petrovich up in the lobby. Grab a copy and read it. Extremely important. If I were to cite some of those proposed declarations, I would say, be truthful, be devoted to your family, be devoted to society, and treat people with respect. But there's 15 declarations, and they're all very important. So grab a copy and read them. Very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please support this very important foundation. Okay, we will start our macroeconomic and geopolitical panel. Before we get started, I want to set the tone for the entire conference, since over the last 3 years since Maidan has happened, there's been a lot of ups and downs. There's been a lot of criticism and finding the blame for the let's call it, slower than desired progress. The one thing I want to say is that we could get it out of the way. We won first place, at least on Ernst & Young, for corruption perception, but that means that we can only improve from here, so there's no need to talk more about the negatives. Let's discuss how we can make Ukraine great. I'd like to first start by asking representative of the President's administration, Dmitry Shimkiv, to speak.
Good morning. Thank you. This is an honor to be here, and I just heard the story about Ernst & Young, and I would like to dwell on it a bit, because it's a beautiful story how disinformation can travel and create a wrong perception in investment climate. How many people in the audience actually read the conclusions that Ukraine is #1 corruption research by Ernst & Young? Okay, great. This report was actually called the corruption, not the fraud in the corporate world. This report was about corporate fraud. And it was 100 people in Ukraine asked, would you pay money to advance your career in the corporation? That story was nothing about corruption in the public sphere or other spheres. That was a story about how non-transparent sometimes is the corporate world within Ukraine. But it was used to misinform, misinterpret, and distributed, circled a different story about Ukraine. And over the last 3 years, we've seen a lot of these stories being created, broadcasted, and misused. And that's actually significantly undermined the work that many investors are taking place in Ukraine. And I think that during the last 3 years, when we look at the state of the affairs, and because we're talking about the macro, and we need to look at the facts that's been done. And I would rather have a discussion about facts, what's been done, rather than through the researchers that are not really talking about some of the facts that are taking place. So 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the government of Ukraine started with 10,000 euro on the bank account. We started with less than $5 billion on the national reserves in the national bank. Today, it's more than 17 billion. Today, we have systems that enabled the government and the public to track all the public finances. Everybody of you can go to the Ministry of Finance, eData.gov.ua, and track how the money is spent. We saved more than $1 billion, almost $1 billion through Prozoro. The budget deficit was more than 10%. It's now less than 3%. We had an inflation of 43.3%, which is now around 9%, and so on and so on. I can bring facts and figures. Naftogaz increased their payment of the taxes 400%. But they had a debt in 2014, $8 billion deficit, $8 billion. Now they're actually reporting profits. We have state-owned enterprises who continue last year was the very interesting year because they start reporting profits versus losses. When we look at the strategy about what's been done and how we're advancing in a lot of initiatives, they are all being based on the concept that we need to first build institutions. And building institutions is a complex process across the globe. Second, it's about closing the gaps which can be used for corrupted practices. Public procurement, procurement of pharmaceutical products, state service, etc. and etc. Government state-owned enterprises. All these are loopholes. I'm not bringing police. This year we will have a new Supreme Court with 120 new members. There is a 650 plus people who applied for these positions. They're going through extremely rigid process. And all appointments of the judges are non-politicals. They will not be political, because none of the politicians has an influence on how this is done. This is done through the Special Council of Council Dobrochesnosti, which is responsible, where there is a big representation of the civil society, and there is a testing happening online for all the judges. Building all these components of the state is difficult. Bringing economic stimulus, difficult. Especially take into account that what's happening in the East, and I know this is investment concerns, and I know should suppose not to talk about security difficulties, but we do have security difficulties. And when somebody says, what's the pace of the reform, why during the last week of January and the first week of February there is no progress on the reform agenda, well, unfortunately, all government and the president was dealing with Avdiivka. And the whole shelling of Avdiivka, yes, there could be security reasons. There is one very important reason. Avdiivka is the very important cornerstone in economic activities of the region, because they are the core supplier of materials for Mariupol plant. And this is an important element to understand, because when somebody is trying to seize assets of, well, not somebody, the Russia seized assets of Ukrainian companies in the East, that doesn't help investors in Ukraine to have a confidence. And that's why in geopolitical context of today, it's very critical to bring international community and the community of investors to put a pressure through the international governments in Russia to return assets that have been seized from Ukrainian owners. And Ukraine is very affirmative on this position. So the geopolitical context is very complex. I still think that we still have a lot of things to improve, particularly in the rule of law. And I think that if you're looking forward to privatization, and I have Malish next to me, who is a big advocate, and the BRD been always a big advocate for privatization. 4G is a good opportunity for this year. I think the state budget can easily get 7 billion hryvnias to the state budget, etc., etc. So there is a lot of opportunities, and I'm sorry for taking this long. But keep going. That's for Ukrainian government and for investors. Ukraine is a country of opportunities. There is a lot of projects and a lot of investments taking place. One of our research institute or a research group with whom we work did a great analysis how many new plants being opened in Ukraine during the last 3 years. It's all around Ukraine. All around Ukraine there is a construction and investments, small entities, small productions, different facilities, international, national, etc. So the economic activity continues, and I'm ready to answer questions if there will be. Thanks.
Thank you, Dmytro. I think that, yes, I would like to also add that indeed the gap between perception and reality is part of the hybrid warfare, unfortunately, that's happening from our neighbor as well. And I think that it's up to Ukraine to try to work on the PR and on the narrative to make sure that the message gets across of what's actually happening. So this is important, and this is why we do such conferences. The second speaker is representative of my home country, the United States. So it's Greg Brian Steele, representative of the United States Treasury, exactly where the money gets printed, yes? So please tell us when we get more.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for having me. I apologize if my comments maybe seem a little off the cuff. I just found out I was speaking about 15 minutes ago. So My focus in the embassy as the U.S. Treasury Attaché is the macroeconomy, the financial sector, the IFI programs, and sanctions policy to some extent. So I'll talk a little bit about our perspective on that. From a macro perspective, I think, as Mr. Shemkiv mentioned, I think there's a lot of credit that needs to be given for what's been done so far. It's no doubt that macro stability has been achieved. From our perspective, the question is now how to drive sustainable, higher long-term growth. This year, the economy is expected to grow somewhere around 2.5–3%. Next year, we're looking at 3% growth, as long as there are no more unexpected external shocks. That's great, but but given where Ukraine is coming from through the recent crisis, where GDP is still, real GDP is still somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% below peak 2008 levels, 2 to 3% just isn't going to cut it. And so we're thinking about ways to go further from there. And the way we see it, there are a few avenues to drive higher growth. It's not going to likely come from consumption, given where the economy is right now and the crisis we just went through, massive decline of real wages, the shock of the banking sector crisis, etc. It's also likely not going to come from exports, given Ukraine's dependency on commodity and steel. You're basically at the whim of global prices and demand there. So for us, it comes down to investment. And the only way to drive higher investment is to make further improvements to the business climate, improve the judiciary. These are the concerns that we continue to hear from the private sector folks that we speak with, and it's a necessary component if FDI is going to meaningfully increase. 1% of GDP this year is way too low. Another opportunity in terms of driving higher growth would be through privatization and SOE reform. There's massive productivity gains to be had there. And then over the long term, if you do those things, you will see higher consumption, you'll see higher net exports, particularly if some of the reforms on the table, particularly with respect to anti-corruption efforts and land reform, are implemented as planned. And so there's a lot of opportunity at the moment. I'm cautiously optimistic. Particularly with respect to with the commitment to reform and the IMF program. In particular, it seems as though the key components of the IMF program for this year are on track to be completed, perhaps a little slower than we'd like to see. But all of the indications suggest that pension reform, land reform, and specialized anti-corruption courts, which are very high priorities for the IMF program, are going to be completed. So that should lead to further disbursements this year, creating a positive, virtuous circle in which reserves are growing, confidence is improving, and the economy is growing. I guess just since I have a limited amount of time, I'll also talk about the geopolitical aspect of things, because it's a panel topic as well. And all I will say is, from our perspective on sanctions, is that the administration has made clear that any sanctions relief for Russia will be linked to full implementation of Minsk. And so I wouldn't expect any changes to policy over the near term.
Thank you. And I'd also like to add that that was one of the things that I felt here as an American when the new administration came in, a lot of Ukrainians were afraid that there would be a swing in U.S. support for Ukraine, but that's not the case. We have good friends from Washington that flew in today to give their support and to say that actually we'll all meet later, but to say that there is full support and there will be continued support from the United States to Ukraine, because that's what it's about. It's about capitalism. It's about democracy and freedoms. Now, the third speaker today, also a fellow American that flew in from Washington, David Snellbecker, CEO of International Development Group, is going to talk about a little bit of history.
Thank you. My name is David Snellbecker. My group, International Development Group, works on economic reform programs. We are right now implementing the USAID trade policy program in Ukraine. Although today I'm going to speak not on behalf of the USAID project, just on my own behalf and my own observations. I've been coming to Ukraine now since periodically since 1990. When I first came in 1990, organized by some people at Harvard Kennedy School and some friends of theirs who thought it would be very important to bring economic ideas to Ukraine in 1990. One of the people who arranged those activities is a guy you probably heard of. His name is Bohdan Havrilishin. He was one of the people I have who organized some of the early activities that I participated in a number of years ago. I want to talk about briefly three topics. One is some historical perspective on why it's been so hard to achieve reforms in Ukraine. For instance, compared to Poland, where things have gone much more quickly. Why is all of this very important? And some ideas for some basic principles for how to move forward and how to accelerate reforms. So a basic hypothesis I have is that Ukraine is a very advanced country in many regards, very high education levels in many regards, but historically the level of management is constrained by, or has been hurt by, Ukraine's history, and that the ability that public management is a very important factor in driving reforms. And if you compare Ukraine to Poland, the histories have been very different, and it's not only what's happened in the recent years, but if we go back in time, the extent to which Ukraine has not had the ability to have responsibility for its own public administration and public management at the national level has been extremely significant. It's historically constrained compared to Poland. And so I just want to look very briefly at the history of Ukraine, comparing it to Poland. I want to show a timeline, and in blue we'll show times when Ukraine had jurisdiction over its own policy, administration, governance, and brown when it didn't. So going back quite a ways to the golden age of Kiev, everything was very good in Ukraine around 980 to 1240. It was the golden age of Kiev. Kiev was actually one of the more developed and centers of public administration in the world, and Kiev and the extent of public administration was very good. Then, of course, on a rainy day in the fall of 1240, the Mongol hordes rolled in and sacked the city. And from 1240, for quite a long time, Ukraine had very little control over public administration, and instead was subjugated to the Mongols, to Poland, to Lithuania, to Russia, to the Crimean Khanate, to the Ottomans, and did not have the ability to develop public administration. There was some periods where there were opportunities for Ukraine to have jurisdiction over its own its own affairs under the Cossack Hetmanate, the Zaporizhian Sich, the independent Ukrainian republics. And then things went from bad to worse under the Soviet period. There were very many factors that severely damaged management in Ukraine. There is the Holodomor, the hunger, dekulakization. You think, who were the kulaks? The kulaks were managers. World War II, the Stalin's purges, centralization, which moved governance all to Moscow. These are not only horrific world events, some of the most horrific events that have ever happened in the world, but they also killed off the management class of Ukraine. And so it's not only what happened since independence, it's the 700 years that before that have given Ukraine very difficult initial conditions in which to govern a country. And then also an important factor of the Soviet period was ethnic assimilation. Ukrainians in the Soviet period fit in very well in Moscow. So if you were good at national management, you went to Moscow and you stayed. And at the end of the Soviet period, people like Aliyev went back to Azerbaijan, Shevardnadze went back to Georgia. Those maybe weren't the best managers, but they are kind of indicative of how managers return to their own countries. But people like Grigory Yavlinsky, Ukrainian, stayed in Moscow. So the initial conditions for Ukraine were extremely difficult without any managers. And then during independence, you know, what I'm saying is not news to anyone. There has been a lot of effort focused on public administration. There's the Soros Group, USAID, the European Union, the International Management Institute. There has been a lot of focus on improving management over the last 25 years, but the previous 700 years are a big constraint. And then just very briefly comparing that to Poland, oops, the clicker seems to have stopped work up there. Okay, so if you click through Poland's history, you had, I won't go into all the history of Poland, but during most of that period is blue, Poland had control over their own affairs, with some periods that were not very, where Poland was partitioned. Even during the Soviet period, Poland didn't have policy autonomy, but still, if you look at ministries, the Ministry of Transport of Poland basically ran transportation, whereas in Ukraine, there wasn't a Ministry of Transportation. There was just that it was autonomous. It was just part of the overall Soviet Ministry of Transportation. And then also since independence, there was a lot of assistance from the EU and from donors to improve management. So why does all of this matter? I gave a similar presentation in the fall at a conference in Warsaw that was on the topic of the future of Europe, and it looked at EU integration and Brexit and lots of different factors, and one of the sessions was on Ukraine, trying to understand how does Ukraine fit into all of this. If you look at the recent history of Europe, since World War II, at the end of World War II, Europe achieved something very important. It achieved an area comprised of Western Europe that, after centuries of conflict, was finally free from conflict, governed by the rule of law and market economies. And then, after 1989, that kind of zone of freedom and market and rule of law expanded eastward. Central Europe also became free. After 1991 and the Balkan Wars, the Balkan countries and the Baltic countries also became free and governed by the rule of law and market economies. And kind of the chaos curtain was pushed further east. And then, of course, the next step in Europe's development is Ukraine. That if Ukraine also can decisively become a market economy and settle the conflict and push the boundary east. That is obviously very important for Ukraine, but it's also very important for Europe as a whole and for the European story of the last several centuries. So lastly, some observations on my views as to what are the 5 elements that are important for advancing reforms. One is that it's really important for there to be grassroots advocacy for reforms at the local level, so across the country. There's the famous saying, power never concedes anything without a struggle. It never did and it never will. Frederick Douglass. The reforms are not going to happen unless the people demand it. And the people can't be demanding kind of just general things like bread prices or electricity prices don't go up. It's very important for civil society to be engaged in advocating for specific reforms, specific laws, specific regulations, transparency, deregulation, anti-corruption, tax reforms, regulatory reforms, and to be engaged. Second, it's very important to work with national government structures. There have been times over the last 25 years when many Ukrainians and also donors have been frustrated with the central government and its ability or inability to move reforms forward. And I would say that Ukraine has kind of flipped back and forth between 2 conditions. One is when reforms are impossible because the central government doesn't want to do reforms, and the other is when reforms are possible but very, very, very difficult because reforms are very hard and there are constraints on public administration. Clearly, we're not in the former status right now, we're in the latter status. There's a genuine interest to do reforms, but they're still very hard. So, and if you only work at the local level, the problem is that when you ask local business people what are their main constraints, they're going to tell you that it's lack of contract enforcement, it's the tax regime, it's the over-regulation of the economy. It's all things that have to be decided at the national level. So it's really important to continue working at the national level. Third, general public administration reform and public administration education are very important, and slowly building up a bureaucracy and a Verkhovna Rada that has not only political abilities, but public administration abilities is very important. Fourth, it's very important to engage with the oligarchs. The oligarchs are still very influential. Ukraine is something like in a historical moment that is somewhat similar to where the United States was, somewhere between the 1880s and the 1940s, when the United States moved from a country governed by oligarchs without the rule of law to a modern regulatory state. And part of that transition came from reform movements and people demanding reforms, and part of it came from convincing the Morgans, the Rockefellers, that they were better off in a state where, with an economy governed by laws, rules, regulations. And fifth, I think it's also digital tools are very important. That digital tools on the negative side allow governments to monitor the people increasingly, but they also allow the people to monitor governments. And so the extent to which there are NGOs and civil society and business associations monitoring government reform, government progress, looking at government websites, smartphones, looking at performance of government entities, all of that is a very important tool for putting pressure to advocate for reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think that that presentation was very useful from the point of view that a lot of people have been asking the question of what exactly is the reason for the gap between some of the nearby countries like Poland and Ukraine, and this actually helped explain it. It's about the history of management. And now with that, I'd like to continue and give a word to our, actually our headline partner for today, a representative of big business. Igor Petrashko is the Deputy CEO of Okerland Farming and Agriculture's big staple of Ukraine. And this is just a case in point about convincing the oligarchs, so to say. You know, we've been doing this with Igor and with some of the other colleagues that have joined us today to work on corporate social responsibility and what the business groups can do to help Ukraine and its economy.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thank you for inviting me to participate and to speak. I can really refer to many points that has been said before. Also, as a former partner of Ernst & Young, I will not comment on the report there, but Dmytro, in fact, had many good points, and really the press, in many cases, misread or misrepresent some of the findings in the documents there. In particular, I would like to maybe start referring to the speech of my colleague from US Embassy. I agree that the direct investments is one of the main driver that can improve Ukrainian economy, and improving Ukrainian economy is #1 priority. Growth of 2–3% is unsatisfactory there. This is in classic theoretical economical terms, this is called stagnation. If the growth is there, but the growth is not satisfactory, and 2% is clearly not. I'm not sure if this microphone is good. Can maybe change this. Yeah, and that's much better. And the growth of 2–3% is by far more not satisfactory after a decline of almost 20%, and after a series of declines since 1990. This hasn't happened just in the last 4 years. We have still not reached the level where Ukraine was after the collapse of Soviet Union, and there are objective reasons, of course, for that. But we are not talking about the past. We need to talk about the future. So. What do we do in order to get the investment? So it's important to understand that investments come from two fronts. Like the foreign investments come, first of all, if the local investors believe in Ukraine and they start investing here. And we are talking, many people who speak about the local investment think about the big businessmen, oligarchs there, but this is not the case. The investments start from the very small companies, from the individual decisions which make their decision whether actually to put money into the bank account or send their kids to study into the Europe or to some other countries, or to invest, to open some local shops, to open some local production, to invest in the expansion of more value-added processing, including in agriculture. This is not the case now. And the key, I think, objective, which we should ask ourselves, and we should ask and demand from Parliament, from the presidential administration, is that what has to be done in order that people, small, middle-sized, large businesses, foreign investors, start making positive decisions about, yes, we can do business here, we can make money, and because again, all investments about making money pretty much, and or making some social impact or providing for their families. So what has to be done? And obviously several good things have been achieved since 2014. Obvious cases which people refer to are e-declaration. I think it was very positive move that provided significant transparency to the many government officials. It's not working yet as it's supposed to be, but this was a very large and big step in the right direction. Prozoro, yes, this was a big move forward. Still has to be probably expanded and analyzed in terms of how it can be more effective there, and to fully avoid, let's say, wrongdoings in the government purchases there, because yes, it has been reduced, but it hasn't been cleared completely. But there are more good reactions to this, to Prozoro system, than bad, so this is good. What is well overdue is the shifting Ukrainian accounting standards to international accounting standards, IFRS type rules. Though Ukraine is one of very few countries in the world who has its own accounting system, which in fact I think many people would say that are impossible to follow there. So it's impossible to maintain proper accounting records according to Ukrainian standards there. And this creates, and we don't need actually to invent anything new. There is a well approved and well adopted system which is called IIS, which is adopted throughout most of the world, and in US there is also a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same. So we need to do this in Ukraine, and this will be a very big step forward. The second thing is privatization, of course. Privatization is a topic which everyone speaks about, but nobody actually wants to make a final decision on this. I'm a proponent of the full privatization, including all enterprises, including even the enterprises that, except like few that are maybe of a military or some very strategic importance, but it has to be very short list. Everything else has to be offered to the through the transparent process, offered to investors and closed. The argument why this is not being done is because the prices are low. Yes, the prices are low. Economy of Ukrainian economy is $80 billion. It's nothing. It's nothing. We are talking about very small numbers. That's why everything which is in Ukraine doesn't cost much in the eyes of the investor. Yeah, so we have to really understand, maybe prepare some of the enterprises, maybe do a stage approach, but it has to be a concentrated government-led decision and a conscious decisions there. Because again, everything which is in government hands is mismanaged. If you speak about business, it's not only about Ukraine. The United States is a great example, whereby there are, I might be mistaken a little bit, but there are no government enterprises at all. All military even production is done on private enterprises. I'm not advocating for this in Ukraine yet but at least we need to forget about the government running any sectors of the economy. So everything has to go private. And that way we will control we will control many things which are currently happening with corruption on different levels, including business corruption, government corruption, because business corruption is linked to government corruption. It's impossible actually to distinguish between two. Third, I think, and the last, so I do not take that long, is something which people speak on a local level. There, like small and mid-sized businesses, but this affects all type of businesses as well, but primarily for small and mid-sized businesses there. We have to finally reform the law enforcement agencies. Nobody speaks about this anymore. But there are no reforms done. I mean, the state prosecution office has enormous number of prosecutors in Ukraine. Nothing changed in the last 2.5 years. Nobody speaks about that. Police, I'm not talking about the traffic police, which was a good example there, but I'm talking about all others, which has not been reformed at all. And you ask everyone on the ground, the same things is there. Fiscal administration, I'm talking about the fiscal police there. It's all those agencies, including anti-monopoly committee and then going to others, are law enforcement agencies which have virtual control on every small, large, mid-sized business in Ukraine, and nobody is doing anything about that. They are overloaded with cases, where there are 10,000 of cases going 10 years and back. There are no system which would force them to put, because people say about the courts are important there, but without enforcing law enforcement, it would not matter. Because law enforcement, I don't know if many know about that, but they don't have even time when they have to present this to the court or close the case. So they can open the case, and this case can be open for years. This is nonsense. This is not present in any country in the world there. And why it's important there for the, why nobody's talking about it is in the government, because there's an excellent pressure on every business which is in Ukraine. As soon as somebody wants to actually get to, on local level, on regional level, on country level, to any business, they just find the case which is open maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there, or reopen it, this case there. There is no, partly if we had a good court system, it would help there, but we don't. And, or reopen the case for any reasons there. We had like, this was with Yanukovych regime. We have now currently, system hasn't changed as well. We had like one case in 2011 when we bought a company in Dnipropetrovsk region there, and from well-renowned Scandinavian investor there, we paid money, everything, and 2 months in a row, the local guy wanted actually to take the business there, and they opened the case, which was like 10 years back, and which going back 10 years, and then we were like, had 1 year of different finding and litigations and raid attacks and everything. And I would claim that not many things have changed. So we need the third reform of the law enforcement agencies should change. Should take place, and the law enforcement agencies should concentrate on the success rate and should be praised on that and should be evaluated on that, and not on number of cases. There should be cleanup on the cases which has been reviewed by the courts many times already there and reopened over and over and again, and it has to be done. Otherwise, the pressure on the small businesses like in the regions would all remain there, and everybody, like the person who works in the state prosecution office on a local level will be more important than the local businessman who runs a factory, and this is not right. This is not European way, this is not US way. So, so there are 3 things which I think are important and probably are key that can be made in the next year, because we all understand that in a year period of time there will be 1 year before elections already, and we do see already right now some of the moves which are more dictated by the, let's say, political necessity than the economic grounds, but I still firmly believe that we have 1 year when some changes can be done by the existing government, by the existing administration, and I'm optimistic there. We do see that Ukraine is coming out. We do see that the macro stabilization, although on very low level, has happened there, and we now need actually to just bring the country to a sustainable 10% GDP growth, and that should be actually done, and the main objective for all entities across the government sector there. So.
Thank you, Igor. So, a couple of those were extremely good points. The rule of law is basically the foundation, especially going back to the U.S. After we said that went from being a little bit more lawless to now being extremely regulated. And in the end, the increased regulation actually brought to much more stability and much better economy. So I think that Ukraine can follow in the footsteps of the United States over the last 100 years or so. Just take a page out of that. And the one big thing that big business can do is teach the entrepreneurs and SMEs how to run a business, how to start a business, and how to provide jobs, and basically teach them how to fish rather than giving out fishes. Next, I'd like to introduce Frances Melange. from the BRD, which is one of the key providers of support for Ukraine.
Thank you. Well, actually, we don't support Ukraine. We invest in Ukraine.
Yes.
I think
Invest.
Support through investment. There's a difference, because we don't do it just to help the Ukrainian people or the country. We do it because we believe that by doing that, we are going to make money, but we're also going to make the country a better place. The two objectives are as important as others. One thing I'd like to say on this panel is that, you know, I think when we talk about macroeconomics, we talk about economic reform, and we talk about geopolitics, and sometimes I have the impression that these are three different topics. And in fact, to me, it's just one. You can't have a strong geopolitical position if you don't have a strong macroeconomy. The leadership in Europe is in Germany because it's the strongest economy. I don't want to talk too much about the recent election in France. People say it's an opportunity to rebalance the French and German partnership. Let me tell you one thing. What is going to rebalance the French and German partnership is if France finally does the structural reform that it needs to do. That's it. And then we'll have a strong economy, and then, you know, the partnership will be rebalanced. It's the same in this country. It's the same in Ukraine. We have to have an open economy, and we have to have a strong economy. Why? Because recently, a few months ago, a delegation from a Western European country came to Ukraine, and they were talking to investors, and they were telling me, you know, our investments in Ukraine are 1%, and I expected them to say 1% of our investment in the outside world, 1% of our investments in Russia. When the time comes to discuss geopolitics, when the time comes to go and influence the politicians, where do you think business from that country is going to fall? On the 1% side or on the 100% side? Have a guess. Right? So we need an open economy, and that is why we need a level playing field. Because as long as entire sectors of the economy are in the hands of a few oligarchs, who are like the unreformed Rockefellers, we will not have an open economy, and nobody outside of this country will have a stake in our future. We need people to have a stake in our future because we don't want to be alone in the world. That's why we need an open economy. Another example is Naftogaz. You know that EBRD has been very active in investing in Naftogaz and in reforming Naftogaz. Ukraine wants to remain a transit country for energy. The best way it has, of course, it's not probably the intention of the people that supply the gas, all right? I haven't talked to them recently, but it doesn't look like they're building up their assets in Ukraine. They're building up their assets under the North Sea. They're building up their assets under the Black Sea. Okay, so how do we make sure that the country can remain a transit country? By having a clean, reformed, professional, attractive Naftogaz. A few days ago, I had some investors here, and they were marveling. It's a positive thing. What's negative is that they were marveling at the fact that now Naftogaz tenders to buy gas are done in a clean way. It's wonderful. I mean, but the fact that they were surprised, you know, rings a bell to me, right? They shouldn't be surprised. They should take it as something for granted. So we need to keep that in that direction, so that Ukraine can remain a transit country. So these are two concrete examples why macroeconomics, geopolitics are closely intertwined. Second thing I'd like to say, and I'm not a historian, so I'm probably wrong, but there is a past, and the past is really bad for Ukraine. We have many centuries of economic mismanagement. We were maybe at the same starting point in Ukraine as Poland 25 years ago, but what has happened in this country is that we've built 25 years of economic mismanagement of an economic system that favors oligarchs. And so it's even harder to undo than what the Poles have had to do. The task is even more immense, but that makes the achievements of this government even more remarkable. Because honestly, yes, people say reforms have not gone fast enough, Ukraine should do more, and so on and so forth. Frankly, if we'd been sitting here 3 years ago, and somebody had predicted that banks that are used to essentially finance the oligarchic economy or launder money would be taken out of the system. That the deficit of Naftogaz, which, let me remind you, in 2014 was the same as the budget deficit of the state. And that's not to say that the state had a small budget deficit. It is to say that Naftogaz had a huge deficit. It will be gone. That people will pay the market price for energy, which in and of itself removes a huge opportunity of corruption. That we would have e-procurement, Dimitro, you mentioned the Prozoro, that actually I don't hear companies complain about VAT receipts anymore. That was the #1 complaint 3 years ago. And so on and so, that we would have a macroeconomic stabilization. If someone had made that prediction 3 years ago, the whole room would have erupted in laughter and perhaps asked that person, what exactly have you been drinking before you went on the stage? Because we are beyond the expectations, clearly, in terms of the achievements. That doesn't mean everything is done, and that doesn't mean we are necessarily satisfied with where we are. And I like your comment on the foundation of the law enforcement, because to me that's the #1 issue why all of these achievements and all of the attractiveness factors of Ukraine, like the great land, the great skills of the population, the IT industry and so on, do not get a fair hearing from investors, because they stop at this #1 foundational question: are my property rights safe? Is there an acceptable level of rule of law in the country? And so, as long as we don't go over that barrier, we can't get a fair hearing on all of the other nice things that the country has to offer. And that's why it's so important that finally it is fixed, that the prosecutor's office is fixed, that the state fiscal service is fixed, and that these elements that drive away investors, that make them not even look, not even consider the rest that Ukraine has to offer, that needs to be fixed. And that is going to bring investors, not just the foreign investors, but everyone. We will succeed if we bring in this country an environment that makes it easy for local investors, just as foreign investors, to invest. I'd like to say, when I look at the future, and when we analyze it as EBRD in terms of what will drive future economic growth, of course you have this fixing the law enforcement issue, which is a huge task. I'd like to say privatization. Yes, prices are low. And you know why prices are low? Because the cash flows have already been privatized. Long time ago, all right? When I see a company that is buying its inputs at a higher than market price and selling its outputs at a lower than market price, to, of course, an arm's length company that happens to be sitting in the same office, right? I mean, with a computer that, that's because the cash flows have been privatized. So, of course, the price is low. There's no cash, right? But then when you privatize that company, even if you privatize it for €1 or 1 hryvnia, it's huge for the country, because then suddenly the cash flows start coming back. Because the private investors, they're not going to let this situation endure, that the cash flows are privatized to someone else. And so that is a company that will start to invest, that's a company that starts to pay taxes, and that is a company that starts to employ people in that neighborhood. So privatization is essential, and the fact that the cash flows have been privatized a long time ago explains why privatization has been a failure over these few years. Because the people that actually hold these privatized cash flows today, they are not willing to let this go without a fight, as you said. Right? So privatization is a huge task. State-owned enterprise reform is a huge task. I don't believe that everything can be privatized, or at least not in the short term, but that doesn't mean that nothing can be done in state-owned enterprises. And again, to put the cash flows where they should be and not where they are today. So that's a very, very big task. We now have a cleaned banking system. We went from a banking system which was majority private and in really bad shape. Now it's in better shape, but it's majority public. So we have two things to do. We have to return it to the private sector, in good shape, preferably, but also we have to see resumption of lending. There's no lending going on in this country, and that's because creditor rights are not sufficiently protected. And so we need to help banks resume lending. That's going to help very much for the investment, especially of the SMEs. And finally, land reform is underway. To me, land reform will be successful if it can create the conditions for financing of land. There's 36 million hectares of land in this country, agricultural land. If you assume, I don't know, $1,000 an hectare or $500 an hectare, that means another 30 billion collateral possible for financing for agriculture. That's massive. It's like 30% of GDP. So if we open this up, the price is really worth it. And so having a reform that actually enables to develop financing for agriculture is absolutely essential. And of course, you have public administration reform. It's been very difficult to reform public administration. You need new people. You need to pay them better, of course. Because someone that makes $200 a month is, of course, going to be very susceptible to corruption. However, it's not that simple. Because if you say, from now on, I'm going to start paying people a decent salary, let's say $1,000 a month, if you're offering that to someone that's making $20,000 on the side, not going to work very well. They're going to go from making $20,200 to $21,000. So you need new people. And that's what we've tried to do. We've started doing with the public reform support teams that we initiated through the National Reform Council with Metro, and then transferred now to teams that are working in select ministries to create the skeleton of the new administration of Ukraine. All of this is work in progress. All of this needs to be built. But again, I think the country has made tremendous progress over the past 3 years, and that a stronger country, a stronger economy means a stronger country, means a stronger geopolitical position, and so the effort needs to continue, regardless of the elections, actually.
Thank you. And it is good that you pointed out, Francis, that EBRD actually has been specifically investing quite a lot of capital, and we need more capital in this country, and the capital is what's going to push the agenda and the reforms, because it could come with covenants. Capital comes with covenants, right? You guys have a lot of them. So that's how you get things changed. You give money and then you say what the rules are. Now, I would also say that regarding privatization, there is an easy way. You just split the baby down the middle, sell off half of all the state-owned enterprises for 1 penny, and have the value go up on the other half while it's being managed properly. That would best of both worlds, maybe. Next and last but not least, I'd like to ask Oleg Ustenenko from the Blazer Foundation to say a little bit about his view.
Thank you very much. I think that it's much easier now, since almost everything was already said by other speakers. In any case, what I would like to say in summarizing from what I heard and some of my views. Yes, the world is moving very fast. Unfortunately, Ukraine is moving not that fast. Look, last year, our neighboring country, they showed significantly higher GDP per capita. Look Poland, almost 15,000 GDP per capita. Look Romania, 6,000 per capita. Look at Ukraine, 2,000. Of course, we can doubt that there is a huge shadow sector in Ukraine, and the numbers might be incorrect, and we have to use PPP, purchasing power parity adjustment, but nevertheless, we are still much below than our neighboring countries. And we were worst performer in Europe. Okay, Moldova was doing a little bit worse than even us, but this is not because we started to do better. This is because there was a crisis in Moldova, and this is very unfortunately. This week, there was already statistics coming from neighboring countries. Poland showed in first quarter more than 4% growth. Romania very close to 5% in first quarter. All other countries which are neighboring to us showed the economic growth on a level of 3% plus, and Ukraine showed growth around 2.5% during the first quarter, 2.4 if I'm not mistaken, in the first quarter of this year. So the world is moving faster than Ukraine. Yes, it's true. We are still very below from the level of 1991, from the period when we started our independence. More than that, we are 65% of the level, even lower than 65% of the level of 1991. So all our neighboring countries are significantly higher compared with that level, compared with the level of 1990, 1989, 1991, depending on when they started to move. And Ukraine is still very well below. And this is a huge problem. And that's why over the last years, we see the intensification of the migration process in Ukraine. Labor people are looking for better conditions. And this is very unfortunately. This is very unfortunately. At the same time, what can we do about that? Look, if we are really going to grow this year at a level of 2%, while the emerging market economies are going to grow at a level almost 4.8%, according to the forecast of IMF for this year, 4.8 emerging market economies and 2%, probably even less, is going to be a growth in Ukraine. This is definitely not enough. Therefore, of course, we can talk about significant progress we made here, but then the issue whether it's enough or not, because the distance between us and our neighbors and the whole world is getting, larger and larger and larger, and we are risking to face new challenges, such as migration of our people, and this is a problem. And how we are going to grow, whether can we grow this year based on monetary policy? Definitely not. This is not the country which can move forward if you soft your monetary policy. Do we have a chance to grow through different fiscal stimulus? In principle, yes. The only issue that we still have budget deficit, meaning that we cannot grow this year through government spending or extra government spending. Export, is it really a good platform for our future growth for this year? Probably not. Yes, international markets are going to be okay, but not more than that. They are going to be okay. Probably not worse, not better, but they are going to be okay. Maybe +2, +3%. But whether it's enough or not for us, definitely not. And then the only source for our growth, I do agree with other speakers, might be foreign direct investments. We can grow through foreign direct investments. But to receive these foreign direct investments, we have to do significant homework. We have to do significant changes in the country. It's impossible to have enough foreign direct investments into this country if we are 5 knots below, according to Standard & Poor's, according to Fitch, Moody's, below the investment grade. 5 knots below. 5 knots below. Last year we received 3.5 billion or around 3.5 billion of FDIs, 2.5 out of which went to the banking sector, meaning that the real sector of economy received around 1 billion. Is it enough to say that we are going to have a real investment growth in the country? Definitely not. Look, our own estimates, because there were people from, agro sector in the panel, our own estimate that Ukrainian agro sector can absorb roughly around $5 billion a year annually. 5 billion. And last year we received only 1 billion. Do we truly believe that this year we are going to receive significant amount of money, close somewhere to 5 billion? No. No, I'm not sure that we are able to receive this money. And then I have other issues coming to my mind in terms of our financial sustainability in 2018 and further in 2019. If we are not receiving FDIs in enough amount, are we going to survive financially? And this is a huge challenge, and this is a challenge which we are going to face very, very soon. So in any case, last summer, we did at the Blazer Foundation, we did a survey based on the US-Ukraine Business Council, asking people at the US-Ukraine Business Council about the main obstacles they have to increase in order to increase their investments in Ukraine. And more than 90, you were talking about corruption. More than 90%, 92 if to be precise, of the US-Ukraine Business Council members said that corruption is #1 obstacle for them to invest into this country. #1 obstacle. And the two other obstacles were, of course, significant administrative barriers for easiness of doing business in Ukraine. And the third one was the court system. So if we are able to deal with these three main issues, corruption, if we are able to deal with the issues related to court system and to business barriers for doing business in Ukraine, then we can really make a breakthrough, because just a normal development which is acceptable for many others, is not acceptable for us, it's not acceptable for Ukraine, because the challenges which we might face very soon, like in a year or so, are so significant, are so huge, that we have to think very carefully in terms of how we are going to survive. From this point of view, I'm still optimistic in this country, and because of two reasons. And the first reason is that we have rapidly growing civil society, and this civil society is watching very closely our government officials, public policies which I implement, and the quality of the public policies on one hand. And this civil society is growing really very fast. Even if you compare with last year or 3 years or 5 years ago. And another one is, of course, our international partners, and including internationals such as IMF, EBRD, all other international institutions, which are, again, putting pressure on Ukrainian authorities. So basically, the Ukrainian authorities are under from the very down, from the locals, from the local society, civil society, and another one coming from abroad. And because of these two pressures, we probably could make significant progress, and the country with huge opportunities might really develop at a much, much faster rate than we are expecting for this year, or we received 2.2 last year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleg. And one key thing is that a lot of heat and pressure ends up making.
I can comment. It's interesting.
It makes a diamond, actually. So please, Dima.
So we've heard a lot of interesting comments, and I just want to comment on some of them because it's interesting. So we've heard that there's no changes in the law enforcement. Well, I'm not going to bring the police into the perspective, even though that there's probably the trust to the police one of the highest. But we removed general supervision of the General Prosecutor Office. That's a big thing. No, we removed it. We removed it. Now, General Prosecutor cannot initiate cases against companies on initiatives or etc. There needs to be a submission and etc. Administrative personnel of the Prosecutor Office was reduced by 75%. We reduced by 16% the quantity of the Prosecutor Office. Yes, it's not perfect and it needs to be removed, but it's going. The process is going. It's a very rigid system. On VAT, Francis mentioned, just last month we reimbursed more than 10 billion hryvnias of VAT, which has a date of the receipt less than 30 days. That's never been a precedent in Ukraine before, and VAT actually been removed. Yes, do we still have a lot of fraud within the VAT system? Yes. And the current Ministry of Finance will be introducing, together with Fiscal Service, the system will be checking an introduction of the, when the documents are submitted or exchanged between the companies, the validation of items in them. Anti-Monopoly Committee, that's actually an interesting case. We have a completely new Anti-Monopoly Committee. We have new cases. And it's interesting that a lot of businesses who have problems with the previous Anti-Monopoly Committee actually priced the competitiveness view of the new Anti-Monopoly Committee. We have cases which had significantly non-transparent, but we also have an interesting behavior of international business in Ukraine, which, if you look at how, and I'm coming from the business, so I understand how the distribution model works. And yes, I know that in Ukraine we don't have a credit notes, but if you don't have credit notes, you don't create unequal competition and trigger antitrust laws. So I think there is a work done by the Anti-Monopoly Committee in a fair way to some companies, understand that they need to change and move to the transparency models, but this needs to happen. So, and the dialogue is absolutely different than it was 3 or 4 years ago. I really think we need to bring law enforcement in the area of protecting investors, and I fully agree on this. Probably the best case is Mriya case. I've been on this case a lot. The international investors who lost significant amount of money because of the corporate fraud. We started with Ernst & Young research at the beginning, which triggered a significant losses for investors. And I really appreciate, if we're talking about cooperation with international institutions, that law enforcement agencies in Switzerland finally address the person and the family who steal the money from Mriya investors. And I think that we would, if we get a bit faster response from international law enforcement agencies on some cases against investors or management of foreign investments in Ukraine, would be significantly helping to advance some of the problems. I'm not going to go to the that we grew of the last year. We doubled the state budget and we doubled financing to the regions. We see a significant interest in the regions and the quantity of actually emerged investments. Several German and Japanese companies which are involved in the electronic manufacturing made the decision to open plants in Ukraine. We had a tough competition with other countries. Every agricultural company in Ukraine, every single agricultural company in Ukraine were making profit during the last 3 years. And I understand that the story of neighboring countries, etc. Yes, Moldova has Transnistria, we have Donbass, both cases created by Russia. And it's quite difficult to, when we say, well, you're not really growing 2%, well, you should go 4.8%. Oh, absolutely, I would love to probably to have less spending on the military, but we have to spend 5% on the military. And I'm pretty sure Poland spending much less. And the subsidies that the Poland receive from the European Union is much bigger than we receive. So I think when we talk about fair comparisons between countries on macro level, you need to be fair. And talking about paying bribes, interesting. The report that I've heard just from now from the Blazer Foundation, completely different from the reports they publish monthly on their website. Maybe there is a disconnect. I read them, I appreciate them, very good analysis. But I would also encourage that you pay attention to Ukrainian compliance rules when you organize recreational visits for Ukrainian government officials internationally. So I think that when we are talking about building a community, building transparent market, it's very important that business plays together. Corruption starts when somebody takes and somebody gives. And if people stop giving, that will be a significant change.
Thank you, Dima. That was great right there. And I think that this is a specific example of why we do these events because a lot of times it takes an open and wide-range discussion across the board to really vet the questions, and we need to do more of this. And also, what I need to say is that this panel has been created to represent a balance. We have a great representative of the President's administration. We have the U.S. Embassy. We have big business. We have EBRD, which is a great financier of Ukraine. We have a think tank here and NGOs that's going to support the fundamentals to help bring up the economy. So I think to make Ukraine great again, we all need to work together. All the people here that represent different points of view, different layers of Ukrainians' macro and economic world need to start rowing in the same direction. And once we do that, I think we will have 10% per year growth. It's all about coordination. It's all about rowing in the same direction. And I'd like to thank everyone on this panel for that. I'd also like to thank our partners, our headline partner, Ukrland Farming, our general partner, Thomson Reuters, energy partner, Recom, conference partner, Starter Organic Business Center, official carrier, Turkish Airlines, Supreme Vodka brand, which we'll taste tonight, Hortitsa, HiCast, our tech partner, and organic products in Ukraine, Biologic UA, and also the Bogdan Gavrilishin Foundation. Thank you, everyone. It took us a while to get started, but please let's continue, and thank you for the lively discussion. I think that if we elaborate on what was said today and use that for the year going forward to actually go in the same direction and make this country great, I think that will work. Thank you.